Happy St. Patrick's Day. Happy Friday. Welcome to another Sudozi Finance Friday. I'm Rose Pankunas, founder and CEO of Sudozi. We help automate budget reporting, approvals, procurement. Every week we speak with a fantastic finance leader, and today I'm excited to have Sarah Keller join. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Rose. Appreciate it.
All right. Now, Sarah and I were chatting beforehand, and she just manages a small budget at Uber, has a tiny team to help her manage that budget. But Sarah, could you tell us a little bit more about your current role?
Sure. So I manage our technology sourcing and supply chain team at Uber. We're responsible for everything from your traditional IT stack to what goes into the product to our supply chain for components like our advertising platform, our Eats environments, etc. It's a small budget. You're right. It's about $1 billion annualized. Give or take a year or so, it can kind of shift. We also have about 56 people on the team, though the team itself is not just pure sourcing our supply chain. We have quite a few operations roles that have expanded over time. And we definitely get involved earlier in the cycle. So this isn't, a throw it over the fence type of procurement team. We're more deeply involved in the different teams and the environments that we're actually supporting and managing.
Yeah, that's great. It's a great place to start, actually. So I know we'll talk about your career a little bit and how you got here, but let's just dive into that on how a lot of our companies that we work with don't have full-on procurement teams, but there are still multiple players and multiple teams involved, right? Whether it's finance, accounting, and obviously the business user who's procuring that product. And so, what are some of the things that you've seen that have worked well in terms of when people get involved in that sort of purchasing relationship?
So obviously, earlier is always better. Time and money, the more time you have, the better you can use that money is kind of a ratio I always give to people. But I've also worked in incredibly dynamic environments. You kind of mentioned a few of the companies that I've worked at before. When you're in high growth or in a hyper growth mode, you don't always have the time or the money to do things. Like you sometimes have to scrape it together to put together what you need to kind of just keep it moving forward. So there was an early Facebook lesson of, good is sometimes better than great. They used to put posters all over the place to give different mottos, but that was one of my favorite ones because sometimes you have to plan for iteration. And if you're going to over index on it, you're losing opportunity and time. And, frankly, whatever money you were going to save is probably gone at the point that you implemented it. So I think there's a very delicate kind of razor edge, particularly in hyper growth. You just have to kind of support. Now, if you've got all the time in the world, you can be really elegant about it. Then obviously more time equals far better solutions that are more suited to what your company needs long term.
Yeah. And so, you mentioned the posters at Facebook. Bring us back to some of your experiences there. Very different time and place, that when you first joined there, what were some of the responsibilities and how you sort of organized that hyper growth?
Yeah. So I was fortunate. I was part of an early developed team to like, I think today that supply chain team is over 120 people. I think I was number 4 and responsible for all network and storage, which, for people who understand network and storage, understand the size and implication of that for where Facebook would have been in 2009. And I think the biggest part of it was the hyper growth. I mean, the company wasn't just exponentially growing. It was like rocket ship growing. And so there was
vertical.
Yeah, exactly. It was just a straight up curve. They had just come out of their kind of stealth mode of just being college to being, let's be broader and open this up to kind of everybody. And everybody started consuming. It was like that year before, it just went massive. And then it just kept growing. So a lot of what was working, let's say, in a smaller footprint no longer worked. So at the time I came in fact, I remember it was eerie how quiet it was for the first week. And then I never felt that way again. It was absolutely like chaotic, in positive chaotic, not a chaotic where people didn't know. I think people were really aligned, and that maybe is one of the best advice for, VPs or people who are developing teams. This is absolutely, if your company is in any sort of growth mode, one of the best things you can do is get people aligned into vision or put them
Mhm, mhm,
into context of what they're doing. Because if they really
mhm.
don't understand where they sit and what part of the ball they're responsible for flowing, then you're going to find people working against each other. But if you can
Yeah.
start with some common vision and some common framework and some common vernacular around how people are talking about things and what is important and what isn't important, you can start to mobilize people, very few people actually,
Yep,
because if you were to
yep.
compare the size of that early kind of Facebook team to where Meta is today, I'll be honest, like, there is a lot of duplicative work that happens, and sometimes you have to build infrastructure to support infrastructure to support infrastructure. And I think, you're seeing some of that in, Mark's rhetoric today. But even then, I would just tell you the reason why they were so effective with so few heads was because they created that common understanding, and it was a priority. It wasn't a secondary or an afterthought. It was the first
Mhm,
thought.
mhm.
And it started from the moment that you started as an employee. Like, they literally had one of the key product people put the entire vision of what the company was gonna do on a board. Jack used to take people at Twitter, or at Square, and he would take them on a walk and do the same thing. So I think if you start to look at companies that are really emulate how successful they were in those early days, you can truly see a big difference that comes from that. Let's come to a common stop under story, understand what we're about, what does good look like, and then from there, you can get everybody moving in the right direction fast.
Yeah, and then you have more context in your role relating to other department leaders. You know where everyone's coming from, right? With that
That's
common
right.
understanding, and you can jump on it for some negotiation or get some vendor or
Yeah.
something much
Yeah,
faster.
I mean, one of the first questions in a negotiation internally, and in fact, funny enough, I will say, like, I've had salespeople I've converted to being buyers, and one of the things that they never understood was how much work it took to sell internally. Because one of the things
Mhm.
you're doing is you're creating common understanding. Because I can't buy something from somebody if we're not aligned on what we're buying and what we need and
Yeah,
what it looks
yeah,
like. So if you start from that as like a conversation starter from a program perspective, then you can really mobilize things fast. And I don't
yeah.
think that that happens enough, to be honest.
Yeah, I completely agree. Even at smaller companies, right? And having that putting that investment in, maybe it's another hour conversation or just some sharing of some
Yeah,
documents upfront to really accelerate each of the teams as they go forward with their projects.
that's right.
And that's something
Because if you
we're
know what's
hoping to
important,
help support.
you're not
Exactly.
gonna you're not gonna index on you're not gonna spend a bunch of time on things that are not essential.
Yeah. All right, let's move forward there. I know there are other parts of your career where, fortunately or unfortunately, there wasn't that exact vertical growth, but you've been able to manage your responsibility and and have your leadership help the companies in different ways. And so, maybe because of our audience as finance folks, talk to me a little bit about your time at Workday and what you helped with there at that phase of the company.
Yeah, so obviously Workday had, I think the day I was interviewing, they were just putting their notice of going public. They were just starting to do their initial filing.
Yeah.
I started after they had gone public. So most of what they were trying to accomplish were technology-based issues. Like, they were single threaded in a very specific technology footprint that was managed by an
Hmm, hmm.
they wanted to have some domain and they wanted control of their own fate. They needed to have some competitive pressure to bring down those infrastructure costs. Again, if you think about a SaaS based company, many of the cost structures that are carried through to customers come from the raw infrastructure that is required to maintain those costs. So the direct
Hmm.
line of, can I keep the cost curve down or flatten the cost curve while
Yeah,
also
yeah.
increasing revenue, becomes like
Right.
existential for SaaS companies.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so that's when I started, that's where they were at. They were in that my curve is parallel to my revenue.
Linear.
It's a
Yeah.
very linear curve. And so at that point, like if I don't start to flatten this, how am I going to actually create profitability? How am I going to drive, the right kind of narrative internally? So that was a key kind of component. But Workday was easier in some ways because of the SaaS cycle itself. It requires quite a bit to bring on, big products like Workday. And that's
Hmm.
more about the companies that are acquiring them than necessarily Workday. I think Workday is a really pretty nice product in general. I mean, more in the sense of to integrate it. If you are using Workday financials, for example, you're not
Hmm.
doing a rollover on that in a couple of weeks. That's a 4 to 6 month cycle of planning and design and architecture, and then rollout testing, and then you go live. So from an
Hmm. Hmm.
infrastructure perspective, it was a completely different scenario where you have a really
Right.
planned
Right.
roadmap compared
Yeah.
to, let's say, a consumer-based product like Meta or even Uber to a certain degree.
Yeah.
We have a very
Yeah.
different curve because our demand signal is coming from public versus coming from, a B2B kind of relationship.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Like not everyone on Workday's, friend and colleague is going to sign on and jump into the app tomorrow, right?
Yeah,
You have that heads up, and that's actually, in other worlds, like relevant to your other people's purchasing cycles, right? Like if this business leader is coming to you for this thing, like, well, when is it actually relevant in the business cycle? Is
that's
it
right.
3 months? Is it 6 months? Yeah, super interesting to think through that
Yeah,
that
and
angle.
it makes a big difference, right? If you're in a situation like that, you can be very elegant. Kind of, I was mentioning
Hmm.
about time
Hmm.
and money. You can do a lot of things to actually drive costs down. You can make it more efficient. You can, make it so it's de-risked. You have a highly compliant product. We did some fancy things with how we kind of did internal like purchasing, kind of from a company to company perspective. There's just a lot of ways that they worked that I think work because of the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Try to use those same designs, and maybe that would be a second piece of advice for VPs or anybody listening to this, would be something to the effect of, you know everybody has a history, everybody comes from a company, but I would say the one learning I have from, the brands that I've been at, whether that was Google or Meta or Workday or now Uber, is none of them were alike. And so I can say that I understand something because I've learned or done that before, but the unique DNA of that company changes the
Hmm.
inputs and the outputs, ideally. So if you come in expecting you're going to roll out like an ERP the same way you did at the previous company, it won't happen.
Yeah.
Guaranteed.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think even if you start thinking about it in a broader sense, the type of teams you build should be structured to the company and to the
Yeah.
culture and what you're serving. Because if you're trying to build for, let's say, really big, like Cisco like kind of infrastructure, but you don't have a Cisco like need, you're going to find yourself in a place where you're over indexed on compliance, or you're over
Right,
indexed
right.
in, head count is too high. I'm just using these as examples, but you can see where the synergy works, where it's like you take everything that and then you kind of pretend that you forget it. When you started a new company,
Yeah.
you work in the same
Yeah.
project that you may have worked 4 or 5 times before. You got to like pretend that you don't know much about it. That's the way you actually make it really efficient, because now you can re-envision how it works in this new environment.
And that's why you are a black belt in this. And really, is I don't think I've ever heard anyone say like, "Hey, you're purchasing your vendor procurement, this way that you operate this large investment of your business should really be a function of the business that you're in now, not how you've done ERP implementations, not how you've purchased, XYZ software from that previous company." Um, so I think
That's
there's a lot that people can take away from that. All right. Any other sort of like must-have tips for finance professionals, accounting professionals trying to do this for their company without a full-time procurement person to work with?
um, so I'm gonna say something that's gonna sound like the opposite, and I apologize for
Okay.
people who are gonna have an immediate response to it. But it's the don't be penny wise and be pound foolish logic. I think people accept
Hmm.
this in a personal way, But in a
Mhm.
business relationship, we think of things in iterative mindset and say, well, if it's wrong, I'll fix it next year. The problem you have, and I would say this particularly from my understanding in my space of expertise, is sometimes when you build in, and I think anybody who's ever done an ERP knows that the moment that you've built that, the ability to change that or to really alter that is now so sticky that you've
Mhm.
now created audit issues, you've created finance flow issues, you have accounting issues. To change the ERP means that you're now having to rewrite a bunch of your finance history, right?
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Now, people get that because they all have got some terrible story from an ERP kind of story that they
Yes.
use to give them a little bit of fear to say, let's do this right. But I think that we do this a lot in other ways in our businesses and don't think about
Mm.
the implication of that stickiness factor. You know, I've done a lot of work with cloud, for example, cloud infrastructure. This is a spot where people go fast and cheap. They perceive to be cheap, but the stickiness factor and the long-term implications of that can actually be harder. So it's better
Mhm.
to make the
Mhm.
investment earlier to keep yourself, let's say, a little bit more um, agnostic, right? Because if I build all my infrastructure using only AWS tools, what is the likelihood I'm going to drive any of my cost structures down with AWS? And I'm picking
Yeah.
that as an
Yeah.
example, but you could
Right,
use
right.
Workday, you could
Anyone.
use
Yep.
Salesforce, you could
Yep.
use ServiceNow. The truth of the matter is that you have to be selective and choose which products actually create efficiency for you versus what you're going to consume from them that tells you there's an efficiency, but now you've got lock-in.
Yeah.
And if you didn't think about it enough up front, now that lock-in factor makes it so difficult to unbind. You're going to spend probably 2 to 3x the amount of money to undo it, to
Yeah.
potentially
Yeah.
do something that better sits for your company. So if
Yeah.
you rush
Yeah.
into decisions on some of these core product sets, the stickiness factor is just as bad as if you were in an ERP, if not
Yeah.
worse.
Yeah. Evaluating that time horizon and how you can get efficiencies in that time horizon, not just your spot price initially, right? And super super valuable sort of framework to evaluate decisions and purchasing decisions
Yeah.
on. All right, I know we're already over time, and so this has been amazing to chat, to have the opportunity to speak with you on these topics. In the last minute or two here, what's one thing, Sarah, looking back on your career that you wish you had spent more time on?
I wish I had started meditating earlier in my career. And I've said that before, but I mean that because I think people churn and burn, particularly early on. You spend a lot of time developing your career. Don't spend enough time taking care of yourself. And I feel like now I've gotten distance. I actually teach mindfulness meditation. Like it's a contribution I give back to my company as part of like one of our ERGs. But structurally, if I had that advice to myself, or if I could go back, I think I would have made myself happier and healthier a lot faster.
Awesome. I love it. And I think you're speaking on mindfulness in a later session somewhere else. So we'll make sure to post
Yeah.
that so people can follow you there. Okay. And wrapping up, fun fact for Sarah.
I'm going to Disneyland.
Yay.
Yay.
Enjoy. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for joining us and enjoy your trip.
All right. Thank you, Rose. I appreciate being on here.
Yeah.
And thanks to everyone who's listening to this.
Have a good one.
You too.
Bye.